So it is my honor and privilege to introduce you all to our panel today. Dr. Donald Brash is Emeritus Professor. Congratulations on your retirement. Your retirement while you're still teaching a class and joining us here. This is how academics and pastors retire, right? But Emeritus Professor of Historical Theology at Palmer Seminary and one of the project leaders for the Science for Seminaries team. Dr. Rebecca Hayes is the Assistant Dean of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math at Montgomery County Community College and is also one of the science advisors to the project. And Dr. Eloise Meneses is Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Eastern University and the Interim Dean of the College of Health and Sciences. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. So I have a simple question for you with very simple, short answer. I'm sure we'll be done in about 5 minutes. But where, Dr. Brash, do you see God's fingerprint in our evolutionary history?
Since I am a theologian and not a scientist, I will refrain from speculating where I ought not to go, which would be the nitty-gritty details of evolutionary processes. That's Becky's job. And rather, speak as a theologian, which is an area where I like to think I'm competent to offer something. And I'll begin by saying that the question, in my mind, may need a little bit of adjustment. I actually prefer non-anthropomorphic language. Where do I see God in the process? Strikes me as better than God's fingers. Is that work? Fingerprints, okay. But I'm not going to nitpick that any further. T.F. Torrance, students of mine know that I not infrequently refer to T.F. Torrance, Thomas F. Torrance, who was one of the leading theologians of the 20th century, a leader of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He taught and wrote that God created, not begrudging creation, a measure of the freedom that God enjoys and with which God created, through which God created. A second theologian, Thomas Oden. He wrote that the preferred analogy for God's work in the world, as seen in the scriptures, Judeo-Christian scriptures, is shepherd. Shepherd, a very non-controlling and yet guiding, non-controlling and yet guiding analogy. And finally, I'll refer to John Cobb. Now, you may be thinking this is a very interesting set of bedfellows, and they are. We don't need to step fully into any one of their perspectives to appreciate what they offer to this question. John Cobb, I think, would remind us that God respects the processes. God respects the processes that God initiates. In the fullness of time, this happens. In the fullness of time, that happens. And Jesus spends 9 months in a womb. God respects the process God initiates. Now, taking those three assertions, I sound like a systematic theologian, don't I? becomes part of the DNA. Regarding evolution, it seems to me that understanding that God shared with creation, and continues to share with creation a measure of the freedom that God enjoys, can help us become comfortable with what seems like the messiness of evolution. Thinking of Odin may help us to see how it is that God is in the process without being of the process. And there I'm backing a step away from Cobb, some of you will notice. And he does that by reminding us that God shepherds things rather than meticulously controlling them. And so when we look at the history of evolution as we understand it at this point, what we see in light of the apparent messiness is also an order that has certain moments in it that seem hard to explain without shepherding, leading us to the place where we currently are in that process. And finally, Cobb helps us to see the reasonableness, the importance of, I'm not sure exactly what language to use for it, but long spans of time. That in these pivotal moments, whenever they were in the course of development, and specific human development, which, as we know, the evolution of humanity is really the rub for many theologians and faithful Christians. Somehow, God has been at work respecting these processes as God also shepherds the processes that God initiated in freedom for us to become beings who can imaginatively consider options and make choices among options. Choices that involve, at the very deepest levels of what it seems to me it means, choices to love or not to love, to appreciate beauty and think about how we might contribute to further creation of beauty in the world, and in a sense become, as it appears science is leading us to this place, people who must consider the future of our own race in light of the virtues that we value. Purpose, virtue, love, these things are hard for me to appreciate as other than something or experiences that are greater than the sum of our parts, if you will. Greater than the sum of our parts. And yet, respecting our evolutionary history, we might want to add that that greater sum turns out to be intimately related to our parts.
I think I'm going to go next then. And first, I'm going to say, John and I did not at all compare any before this, yet perhaps unsurprisingly to some of you, we have some very similar themes, including that the idea of fingerprints at first threw me, and I had to think through, not necessarily where do I see God's fingerprints, but where do I see God in this? Where do I see presence? And what I started with was thinking about what does Scripture tell me about God first? And that's that our God is a God of improbability. Throughout Scripture, I see a God who does things not in the way I expect, not in the way we wanted, but he does them in his own way. He's also a God of miracles. He is a God who does not give us all of the answers because he doesn't feel that we either need them all, deserve them all, or something. He wants us to take things on faith. And if he doesn't give us all of the answers about faith, things, and we actually have the Bible for those things, why do I expect he would give me all of the answers about how life got here or science works? But then I also see some pretty important things about what God wants for us and who God is, even in the very nature of triune God. And it's the idea of unity and communication. And when I think about what it means to be human and how do we get human, I think about the improbability that life would exist at all. That humans are capable of having babies is a miracle. The steps that are necessary to have one require going through meiosis to produce sperm and egg, and to do so in a way that they are both viable, that when they finally combine, that they will form an offspring who is viable. And viable by this, I mean that it has the correct genetic information, not too little, not too much, the right pieces of the cell to develop into a human. It then needs to implant. It then needs to grow, to develop, to go through all of these steps. And as many of you may well know, and if not, this perhaps for some of you will be helpful to know, that something probably less than 50% of all pregnancies that start somewhere around there actually result in a successful birth. We know it is much lower than we would like it to be, simply because of the things that can happen during development that result in an egg not implanting or a miscarriage. And then there's all of the protection that's necessary to take a small child that would, face it, roll off of a flat surface and get that child up to an adult. The amount of work that's necessary to do that well, probable that we have life. But if I look at evolution, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. It's not just about the evolution of humanity, it's about the evolution of life at all. I'll think about the prebiotic soup of early Earth, where we have lots of volcanic activity and lightning strikes, and this liquid separated from land a little bit, but this prebiotic soup of material where chemical reactions are happening and things are forming. And somehow these things, some of them at some point in time developed into a protocell. So something that's not really a cell, but it was this, I get the name of the writer at the moment, but he talked about how the first cell was something like a leaky plastic bag of goo. And somehow this first cell started communicating amongst its own parts. It learned to recognize self from other. It grew. It learned to regulate its own needs. It did metabolism. It cooperated with itself. And eventually that cell grew. It divided, and it became two cells. And then we had two cells of life. And things continued from there. The transition from single-celled life to multicellular life, improbable, definitely a miracle. The movement to land, we don't necessarily know why it happened. There's lots of theories. As we look at humans, the development of the brain, our cognitive ability, our ability to not only learn, but to teach, our ability to hunt, to do agriculture, to develop community. All of these things required different types of brain activity to install, perhaps in other organisms, but the more we study them, the more we see that some of these are there too. For a long time, we thought tool use is what made us human. Yet there are birds, there are reptiles, there are other mammals that use tools regularly. So where do I see God in this? I see him clearly in the miracle that life exists and that we have human life, in the improbability that our life exists the way that it does. But I see his characteristics of communication, not only between each other, but within the cells of our body. I also see it in our search for meaning, something that does seem to set us apart from a lot of the rest of the life. Our search for meaning, our appreciation and creation of things that are beautiful, like music. But I also don't expect to see God directly in this. When I see how God works in Scripture, we don't always see him acting directly. He's there holding it all together and often in the background. And I expect that that is how I would see him then in this as well. Because if I were to say, well, this is the place where I see God having done something, and sometimes science were to explain how that happened without God, I have set myself up to remove God and the need from God for my understanding. So I need to be very careful about that. Because as a scientist, I know that we're always going to find new explanations for things. So I prefer to not put my faith in God on one little point that someday somebody might say, and this is how it happened naturally. Because then I'm going to have to question my whole faith.
Okay. I have to say, too, we did not coordinate this because there's so much, even in what Ron said, that is coming through you, the love and art. And so many of the same ideas that I've had. In answering the question, I'll just say, where did we see God all, right? The best I can do with this is to look at the overarching narrative that we see in evolutionary history. So first a caveat, I'm a cultural anthropologist rather than a physical anthropologist, though I've taught the class. So I also have to defer to Becky for the details. And I have to defer to Don for anything having to do with theology or biblical accounts and so forth. Nonetheless, what I thought I'd do is, if you'll be a little patient with me here, I want to look at that big narrative, the evolutionary narrative, and then the biblical narrative, and see if we can't see a bit of an overall structure that they have in common. So first, the evolutionary narrative. So we start 4.5 billion years ago, and we have a very long period of no life, and then a very long period of just single-celled life. And then at about 500 million years ago, we have the Cambrian explosion. And what happens there is, all of a sudden, seemingly in evolutionary terms, out of nowhere, we have kaboom on life forms, all kinds of life forms flourishing and branching out to fill eco-niches around the world. So then after that comes this, after this period of flourishing, comes something that's more disturbing, and that is the Great Dying. And at that point, at about 250 million years ago, 90% of all life on Earth died. It differs whether you go by land or marine, whether the species were more marine life, less land life. But still, 90% of life died. And out of that came just a remnant, I'm calling it, a strand, a remnant, that survived the Great Dying and then flourished again. So now we have a second flourishing, and everything is going out over the world, and we call it the age of the reptiles, and the dinosaurs were flourishing and all the ferns and so on. And that was a great period of flourishing, which, as we all know, ended at 65 million years ago with an asteroid and the death of less than 90%, but still a great mass extinction went on, and we lost all this life and all these forms, and yet there was a remnant, and the remnant was the early stages of mammals, who then flourished and developed, filled the eco-niches and so forth. And we come through the age of mammals. Then we have the hominin line, so the early forms of the apes and humans developing at about 4 million years ago. And now there's a flourishing of what we would probably want to shake hands with, people we could probably communicate with, although they're pretty different than us. So the Australopithecus forms and some other forms are developing at that time, and their lines end. So this is the disturbing part for us, isn't it? That, we have this flourishing again, but so much gets lost along the way. And yet their lines end. Homo sapiens line survives that and begins to develop. And now we have the whole period of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, these are the parallel forms that were in Asia. And those all develop out. And we know that we had contact with them. We have Neanderthal DNA in us. But nonetheless, those lines basically died out, and Homo sapiens, that remnant survived and came through to the present. And then comes I think the most important event, which is the flourishing of art and of symbolism. I also picked art as that point at which we become human. And so cave paintings and Venus figures, burials with all kinds of symbolic objects, and so on. So that's our kind of grand narrative for evolutionary history. Now let's take the very brief view of the biblical narrative and say we have Adam and Eve, which if we're pulling them together with the evolutionary story, we would say they were a kind of remnant. They were chosen. They were called out of the peoples of the time by God to found a new line, a line of people that he was going to call into relationship with himself. So Adam and Eve are called out. Others, the rest of the time, their lines end. Then we have the great destruction by the flood in the biblical narrative. I'm just using the narrative of the biblical story. And Noah and his family are chosen out, and there's great destruction. After that, Abraham and Sarah are called out from amongst a whole lot of other peoples who were not called. They were chosen. As I understand it, theologians will call this all the scandal of the particular. Isn't that right? That it seems like God isn't being even-handed when he does this. Then, nonetheless, that seems to be the pattern. The Israelites were chosen out from the other tribal groups that were there at the time. Why weren't the others fairly treated? But they were chosen as a thread, a remnant to be brought out from humanity, to be given God's message for the world. Then Jesus himself is chosen, and now the Israelites to some degree are left behind. As the church develops, and as we understand it, the Christian faith becomes the development of the kingdom of God. So you see my point here. There's something going on with a creation and then a flourishing and then seemingly either destruction or being left behind as a single thread. A remnant is pulled out and carried forward, and then that flourishes, and then the same thing happens again. So, what I'm suggesting is there's some kind of a structural parallel here between what we see happening in creation and what we see happening in the biblical story. I will say that in our understanding, when we look at evolutionary history, they always talk about survival. But survival is a highly loaded term. We talk about being chosen. We say called for a purpose. And so I think our understanding of it has more meaning, more depth, and more reality to it. Something is being called out, chosen, redeemed, brought forward, and we look forward to the day when we will see a new creation and a new heaven and a new earth, and God will complete his work. So that's my primary point. I did also have some secondary points about there being design in nature. Zach said we should go ahead and give you everything at once, so I'll go ahead and do that now. So I'm not stopping is the point. So, there's debate over there about whether there's design in nature. I understand that those folks working in intelligent design can be very controversial. But leaving aside the technical aspects of what they're doing, and I certainly agree with your point that if you pick something and say, well, this is where God is, you're going to lose on that one, right? But the big picture, the overarching question of there being design in nature, I don't know how they can deny it, honestly. I find Richard Dawkins' attempt to deny it somewhat humorous. Here's how Richard Dawkins, you're probably aware, is an atheist, and he uses evolutionary history to try and to discredit the idea that God exists. And so as a result, here's how he defines biology. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That's a very backwards way to define a field, to say, it looks like there's design here, but there isn't, and that's how I'm going to design biology. He says that 1 in 100 billion is acceptable odds for life having occurred on Earth by accident. He accepts that as an odds, 1 in 100 billion. And then he says, in order to, kind of cover up what seems obviously to be a problem, he says, our brains haven't evolved to the point of understanding this. How it can be so improbable that all of this could happen. And I'm talking about the big so-called accident, right? Any particular case, of course, Stephen Jay Gould, who I admire, who is also an atheist, he would say, yeah, but look at the panda's thumb. And he gives us specific examples of things going wrong or being, evolved in a direction that doesn't seem to make sense. There are those, without a doubt. And I think your point, Dawn, about processes being allowed to continue can help answer why there are these, I'm going to call them exceptional cases where things don't work out. But in the big picture, the design seems to me pretty obvious and pretty hard to escape. So I'll remind us of David Wilcox's work. He was here in our Department of Biology. He's a geneticist. He's written a book called God and Evolution, a very nice short little synopsis that you can take, and he is, of course, a geneticist, so that helps. But in any case, he reminds us of Aristotle's 4 types of causes. And when we're trying to look at something and say, well, what caused this? He says there's the material, this is Aristotle, he says there's the material cause, which is the raw material or the substance of something. And then there's the efficient cause, which is the immediate force that is acting on it, right? And there's where we're looking for accidents or things actually having happened. And then he says, however, it's still Aristotle, there's the formal cause, which is the blueprint for the thing. And the folks in intelligent design are mostly trying to work with these blueprints, trying to say, show that there's a blueprint here. This isn't happening by accident. And then there's the final cause, and that is the maker's original intent and purpose. And that's where I'm sort of resting my case, right? In that we can work out all the technical stuff, but when you step back and take a look at the whole thing of evolutionary history, and the whole of creation and how it functions at that final level, that's where I think we can intuit or see most clearly the maker's original intent and purpose. And now I want to put in a footnote here and say, we don't see anything with certainty at all. And there I would cite Michael Polanyi. He was a Nobel-nominated chemist who did philosophy of science, not particularly a Christian, although he admired Christian thinking. And he said, in any science, what we get are clues, not certainties. And when we get these clues, they start stacking up, and then we flash a light, we intuit. Now I think this got to be the case. It just got to be the case. Einstein, he says, used exactly that method to arrive at the theory of relativity. And so he didn't add up the facts and say, okay, now I get it. He said, oh, this looks like that. And then bing, flash a light, right? So it's in that way that I would say, even if you weren't a Christian, you could intuit the probability of a creator. That in fact, there is likely to be a designer just looking around and taking the clues, not establishing it with some kind of legal certainty.
Thank you for that. For challenging the premise of my question. I have been accused of making God anthropomorphic in the past. I think we all have, in many ways, that God in our minds becomes this sort of, what is that, humanity with a megaphone, right? I forget who had said that. So at this time, if whoever wants to be the first questioner can approach the microphone, or you can type it in the chat, and I will be watching for those things.
So there's a question that a friend of mine asked me that I had difficulty answering. This is an atheist friend of mine. And I know that there are many different ideas about how to answer this question. I'm very curious about how the panel would answer this. If sin and death entered through Adam, how do we explain the death that occurred long before humanity? Thank you.
That strikes me as primarily a theological question.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we're all looking at you.
I thought I'd wait a moment just in case someone else wanted to dive in. Well, since we have the fact of death occurring before humanity comes on the scene, and the fact that death occurs to hominids, including Homo sapiens, very early on, we might want to sort the problem of suffering from the problem of evil and ask what may have what may it be that makes death different now than it was? Human agency has amplified suffering in many ways. And so it seems to me that one could hear in the Genesis narratives something like, and Reinhold Niebuhr makes much of this, or at least some of this, that in that narrative we should hear something like, "You shall surely die." Death becomes a source of anxiety for him, and anxiety then becomes a source of taking matters into our own hands at the expense of our neighbor. And so we have that amplification of the meaning of death, and even the amplification of the ways that we can suffer by way of human agency. So that's one approach I would take to the question. But another has to do with the status of Adam. And Peter Enns writes about this in The Evolution of Adam. It is, and the question is, do we really need an historical Adam to explain sin and death in the world? And that's a very large question, with many people trying to answer it in many different ways. I think we need to face, in a sense, the facts on the ground and decide what it is that Paul really means to be saying, or need to say that differently. What might we say is meaningful about what Paul says about Adam as we consider the facts as we see them in our time? And I think I've done justice, Peter, to what you say in your book. Do you have a follow-up, David?
I would say from a biological perspective, death had to have existed prior to Adam. Whether or not Adam is historical or not, death also pre-existed humans as a group. Death is a natural part of life, and it is that human perspective on death, I think, that is different there. That death is inevitable, and we are the ones who fear it. And I think that part is perhaps tied to sin, tied to an understanding of God, of an afterlife, of all of these things. I think that those go together, but the idea of a physical death is quite a natural thing. Spiritual death, that could be a different area for theology, as you mentioned.
Well, this is not going to be very helpful, but I consider that to be our most significant and important question, the one that we need to answer, and I don't feel that I have a solid answer for it, except to say that narrative thing I just did was part of my answer to what the role is of death in general.
May I add one thing, that I don't like to think of what I'm saying as an answer, but it's simply a way of addressing the question at this point in time. Speaking of evolution, my thinking continues.
Amen.
It's on the same theme, so I'm not opening up another question, but the question of how did death happen before Adam, I think is the same answer to whatever it is, to how did salvation come before Christ. It's both answers are the same, I think. The way I explain that when people ask me is it's still through faith in God. Right? Abraham had faith in God, not faith in Christ, and he was saved because of his faith in God. So we don't need the event to come before in order for it to be the effect in God's kingdom. That's not an answer either, that's just
Hello, thanks so much for your time. My question is directed, I guess, mostly at Dr. Meneses, but feel free for the rest of you. It seems that the discussion so far, correct me if I'm wrong, but seems to be coming from a place of, the paradigm of evolutionary theory being fact. I'm a little curious, Dr. Meneses, and this is very respectful. I've heard you speak a couple times this semester. I'm a Campolo scholar, so I heard you speak before and very touched by your thoughtfulness. But when you talk about the arc, of the timeline, seems that you speak of the evolutionary timeline as fact, and then when you got to the biblical narrative, and particularly the flood narrative, you seem to approach it with a bit of skepticism, sort of said, hey, this is I'm just talking about the biblical narrative, not say my opinion. So just wondering, sort of maybe I read that wrong, but why the feel of the need to sort of impose that, hey, this is what the Bible says, not fact, and then the evolutionary theory as fact. Again, very, very respectful of you guys. I'm coming from, somebody who doesn't necessarily believe in theistic evolution. So Dr. Brash knows I like to push back a little bit, but that's just, very respectful in my question. So thanks.
Yeah, I understand, and you have every right to ask that question. I think it's a fair one. I think you did read me correctly, too. So, all right, so just the simple answer. The simple answer is I qualified it there because I was quite sure there'd be people in the room who would not think that the flood was universal. In other words, it wasn't worldwide. It may have been a regional flood, and I know that's a discussion out there, so that's why I kind of qualified it. But I wasn't quite qualifying it maybe the way that you mean. I wasn't trying to discredit the biblical narrative. I was trying to answer what might be an objection to me taking it seriously. Do you see what I mean? So I was taking it plenty seriously. So I think I'd like to, answer two questions. One is, why am I so convinced that evolutionary history is, like, as you say, fact, right? I do think that when you look into the evidence, and here Becky may want to speak into this too, but when you look into the evidence, it's overwhelming. And when you I won't, the whole set of arenas in which there are science going on, everything from astronomy, actually, to geology, to the fossil records, to genetics, and they converge on a kind of a story, and it's like a puzzle, with pieces missing, but everybody's putting together pieces within the puzzle, and there are points of confusion, points of lacking evident, but the big picture does seem to be pretty solid. So that's what I would say about why I'm there on that. But on the matter of the Bible, as best as I am able, I consider the Bible an authority over my life. I am not an authority over the Bible, and I don't think any Bible scholar who's a Christian is an authority either. They may know a lot about it, but the Bible itself is, it's a record of what all of God has done, but it has also got guidelines, and it is on the whole over me. I'm not over it. And so that means when, as a Christian, I try to bring this evolutionary story together with the Bible, then I'm looking to say, what does the Bible mean, not where is it wrong?
I'm first going to say my background is in ecology and oceanography. I have taken probably more biology classes than anything else, but a pretty fair number of geology and chemistry courses. And I have not studied human biology really as what I study, so I feel like I should mention that part. For me, I have to judge the scientific, I'm going to use the word evidence for this, on its own merit. Do I believe that God is the creator? Absolutely. I cannot, in my head, with all of the scientific knowledge I have, I cannot deny that from what I interpret scripture to mean and from what I actually see from science. And as a scientist, I'm a skeptic. I think most scientists are, by our very nature. We're really good at asking questions, and I'm going to write a note to myself to come back to this idea at the end of this. But there is evidence from astronomy, from chemistry, from geology. I have taken courses in isotope and geochemistry. I studied well the ideas of radioactive decay and how all of that works, and I have questioned how it works. For me, when I look at it, when I look at the work of other scientists, I feel confident that it is correct, in part because of how scientific research is done. When scientific work is published, the work has to, generally speaking, many of these studies take 5 to 10 years of work before you will read them. They go through a process where the scientists will develop the ideas, they will come up with hypotheses, they will develop their methods, they will explain their experiments, then they will work to get funding for that work. And those funding grant applications are reviewed by other scientists to see if the work has merit, if the work is good. Publications today, once the work has been done, will go through a team of reviewers who are other scientists, and they're not allowed to be your friends, by the way. Because when you submit a paper for publication, you have to submit the names of the people you work with, the people you have grants with, and all of those people are disqualified from reading your work because they would be biased for it. And sometimes you're asked to submit the names of the people whose work doesn't agree with yours, and they'll make them read it to see if it still makes sense. So when scientific research is published, it goes through this peer review process where its very nature is doubted by scientists. And evolution, you probably hear is a theory in biology, and that is true. Biologists, in part, I think, just don't like the word law, but you'll hear about chemistry and physics, you'll hear about laws. In biology, we don't really use that word. A theory, though, in biology, and there are only 5, by the way, a theory is something that has been supported by thousands, if not millions, probably here millions, of different research studies. The theory of evolution is one. The other theories are things that you would be so familiar with, you would think perhaps these are laws. The cell theory, that all living things are created from cells and that all cells only come from other pre-existing cells. I'm going to pause there for a moment because that means that, yes, even biologists will tell you cells can only come from other cells. Biology has no idea where life started and how we got life. They don't have an answer. We have the gene theory, that what happens in your cells is directly controlled by your genes, by your DNA. You all know this. Ecosystem theory, that the parts of the environment are affecting the things that live there as much as the things that live there affect the environment. And then homeostasis, that there is a protective range in which life exists and life works to keep itself inside of that protective range. For humans, our best example is that we try to keep our body temperature in a very small range. If you go 10 degrees outside of your normal body temperature, you may not be alive. If you are alive, you are seriously ill and in need of medical intervention. So biologists have put evolution on the same plane as all of those things. That is the amount of support that there is for it. And work has been done by countless scientists to disprove all of this as well. And that for me is where I find a great amount of comfort with it. Having said that, I grew up in a church that if you were to walk in the door of it today, you would find that people would say, there's no way that scientists grew up here. My church definitely would be in the young earth creationist camp. I wasn't, but it is not that I don't have respect for those people. I absolutely do. And I think that you don't have to believe in evolution to take science seriously, but I think it makes you question evolution when you're in science. I think it's something that all scientists will grapple with. As for scripture, I honestly don't know what I think of the flood. I don't. But I question a lot about it because of how often we see it throughout cultures, that this is something very deeply rooted in us, that there are so many flood stories throughout the world, even through cultures that were never connected to each other, that all point to that same time period. that makes me think that there was something going on, regardless of whether or not it was a worldwide flood, that something happened then that I think we still need to grapple with and understand better than we do.
I appreciate very much Eloise reminding us of the importance of looking for the meaning in the text. And I also appreciate, Becky, the reference to the apparently universal stories of floods and what that might indicate even about human history. I hear in your question, Roland, as has been at least touched on by Eloise and Becky, the question of status of the scriptures and what we make of them. And it just seems to me that, like, the theology begins and ends not really with an apologetic move, but with a faith stand. And as I know, you know, and others know here, there's quite a span of options on the spectrum of the divine-human encounter as it relates to the scriptures. And each of us will take that stand where we do, and how we take that stand then becomes an important question. Are we going to approach the scriptures in a way that is deductive? I have these assumptions about it, and then might miss some of the details even within the texts that might press against those assumptions. Or are we going to approach it more inductively and see if that inductive approach might actually lead us to adjust what we believe about the scriptures while leaving intact their authority for our lives? And so I'm basically back to what Eloise said. I think that in the texts we have the meaning-making, we might say, the meaning-making stories that God wants us to have and wants us to search through and sift through together in community. And I'll refer back to something Becky said earlier, reference to the doctrine of the Trinity. I think I'm right in remembering that there's something about community that is essential, not only for but for Christianity, certainly essential, and that proceeds from our understanding of God. And we ought not to be surprised then if there isn't stuff that we have to talk about, struggle with, and debate.
You brought up Dr. Brash meaning, right? Meaning and purpose, really, which I think is the most important thing in life, right? Meaning and purpose. In schools, right? Especially in public schools, in the science arena, I would say, evolution, right? Push is a fact, and just naturalistically, and and really mutative, right? And that's all that we look at, right? That's the only perspective that we're given. Do you think that the school place has an obligation to provide meaning and purpose? And if an education doesn't provide meaning and purpose, do you think that is a good education?
Well, I'll talk because nobody's talking. When my husband and I first moved to this area and joined the Mennonite community here, we discovered that in all the churches, the great debate was whether to put their kids in secular schools or to keep them in Christian schools. And they had a common funding, a fund that they could allow to, all of the children of the church to go to Christian schools. So I think it's a very difficult problem, and it's a matter of balancing out what we expect secular society to do for us and what we expect the church and our families to do. And I think there'll always be a tension there on that balance. It can be pretty bad where schools are teaching things that we feel are really not good. And then you've got to try and deal with it at home. I'm not thinking of us so much as the Soviet Union, in which they would, children were really brainwashed in their school system. And had to do things like report on their parents. And then you go to the other extreme of saying, well, it's just a secular school, we'll keep it all secular, and trying to split the matter of meaning and purpose and having it only in one arena or another. That's just not possible, because whatever they teach, it's going to have some larger meta-narrative associated with it, and it will teach something. Meta-learning, Gregory Bateson called it. There's the learning and the material, and then there's what you learn from having learned the material and what you eventually think about life because of it. So you can't escape the problem, and I just think because we are a church living in a larger world that is not Christian, that's going to be a tension.
I grew up in public school. I went through public school. I went to a state college. Undergrad was at a state grad school to state school. I now work at a community college. I did work here for 10 years, though, in the middle of all of that. So I'm very comfortable in those spaces of, I suppose, of public education. And what I would say is that I think, if I'm talking about in a science classroom, the last thing I think I want is a science teacher who's an atheist trying to teach the creation narrative, because I think they would do it a very bad disservice, and faith a bad disservice. Because I think the whole discussion of it would be, and clearly we know God's not involved, and that would, I think, do a lot of harm. And I remember back to my biology textbook that mentioned that, evolution was one theory of how we got life. And then there were people who believe in creation. And then there are some people who believe that life came from an alien planet. And the idea of creation and life coming from an alien planet were kind of put on the same level, which is so problematic, because I then really wanted to know, and my teacher had no good answer for, how did the life get started on the alien planet? Which was apparently not the question I was supposed to be asking. But when I think about evolution, we really need to take a huge step back, because the one thing evolution does not and cannot do is explain how we got life. It doesn't. We often confuse it with doing that. Evolution talks, if you will, about how life has evolved after life exists. Evolution provides no idea of how life got started. There is lots of research that is ongoing about how life might have started, but science has no answer for how life started. There are ideas, there are hypotheses, there are not theories yet, we're not there, there's not any evidence that can get us to those yet. And I think that should be more clear in some of this conversation, is that evolution only happens after life exists. But I do think that in the public realm, there is room to talk about meaning and purpose, because I think that's one of the really good things that Christian education does, is we talk about vocation and calling and connecting what we do to who we are. And I think that people could benefit from that in all walks of life. So I think that's something where there is more space to talk about meaning and purpose and bringing those things together with identity and how we exist in community with each other.
One of the frustrations of my position is that when I speak, people actually do listen. And I have also found, I guess comfortingly, that the longer I speak, the less they listen. So this is not my role. This is just a genuine inquiry related on my own development, in that for many years being in an evangelical conservative church, this was the touch point, the lightning rod that you either believed in God and the Bible or you were an atheistic evolutionist. My older brother walked away from the faith over it. When you read the sociological studies of the exodus, the mass exodus from the church with young people, oftentimes it is this issue where early authorities in their church are discounted by the sheer exposure to brilliant, caring thinkers who don't believe in God and are trying to understand the mystery of the world with an openness and a sense of urgent truth. I found in my own being the need to try to defend God in this realm, as if, first of all, God needed defense, and secondly, that I was even capable of understanding the question. And so what comes to me is the point you made, Becky, that if we set up a relationship that is adversarial, there is no way to overcome that with a centrist position, because it's either one or the other. And so I'm sure there's a question there someplace, but for me, I remember a comment that Carl Sagan said, and it goes back even to the scriptures where it says, it's the glory of God to hide stuff and the glory of kings to discover stuff. And I think Carl Sagan said, I believe if there were a God, that God could probably create an old earth that was actually a new earth that looked old. So that all the records would look like something, but it wouldn't really be true, and it's a divine cosmic joke. If God is that, I will not believe in God. And that sounds like a pretty honest statement, because it means that God is capricious and is setting up faith against knowledge. And yet, knowledge is important. Proverbs says, get it, though, cost all you have. And of course, as a higher education institution, we try to realize that. You know, but that's my concern. How do we help young people, and also our fundamental soul questions, not be threatened by things that seem adversarial? That's all I got.
And if I can also add to that question, one of the Zoom questions is along those lines, where Travis Patton had said that mathematician and Christian John Lennox says, faith is a response to evidence, not a rejoicing in the absence of. Much of the scientific community disagrees with this, but how can we reconcile this issue? So you're kind of on the same page there, wondering the same things.
I wonder if one way to address the problem of the experience that you've shared, Dr. Matthews, that is at the root of so much of the controversy and penetrable conflicts that we have within the churches and societies, is our tendency to thinking in polarities. And I'll refer to, my suggestion is that as we train pastors, we ought to be, some of us, that's our primary work here, training pastors. We ought to be considering what it means to mature. James Fowler talks about stages of faith. And at the most mature state, there is a tolerance for ambiguity. There is a shedding of the need for either or kinds of thinking to secure the self. And here I'll put on another hat that I have. I actually am psychoanalytically trained. And as it turns out, the goal of psychoanalysis, at least in its modern psychoanalytic expression, is to help people in the process of maturation. And one of the ways of understanding what that looks like is just what Fowler talks about, the ability to tolerate ambiguity. The world presents us with the necessity of being able to do that. The fear of lacking conviction enough to be saved strikes me as one of the problems that we encounter in the churches. And so perhaps adding an extra dose of preaching on the grace of God would help people in their progress toward maturation. But I would say that also might help people accept the fact of their own questions, that we push away questions at the periphery of our minds. Not only do we push away other people's complicated questions, difficult questions, but we push away our own complicated questions when they cause us anxiety, especially the anxiety that makes us feel ontologically insecure, insecure about our existence in the world. And so really focusing on the God who is faithful and gracious, rather than, or more so, and I'll even say rather than focusing on the people who must be faithful, strikes me as a good move toward helping people tolerate the ambiguity that is a mark of maturity and that would contribute positively toward at least helping to resolve the wars within the church itself. I mean, in American culture right now, what do we have? We have the church at war with itself. In part, I think that's what's going on. And so if we begin with the household of faith and conscientious efforts at what I'm talking about, I wonder what then our witness will look like as we live that out in society.
Thank you.
If you were to ask the students that had me here for the course Evolution, Creation, and the Organization of Biology, which is a 400-level course in the biology department, they would tell you that one of the things I did in that course was I didn't really answer too many questions, as much as I asked them a whole lot more. And I kept telling them they had to get some level of confidence in not having all of the answers, in accepting that they don't have all of the answers. And part of what a good scientist does learns to ask really good questions. I think the same is true of a person of faith. I think that asking questions of our faith, asking questions of Scripture, of each other, of our pastors, of God, is a mark of maturity. And I think that for me, gosh, my experiences in the church were so, and some of them were so wonderful, and some of them were absolutely horrific as someone who was interested in science. My parents raised me to embrace my faith and also helped me to explore my interest in science. We went to national parks. We went to the Smithsonian. We went to all sorts of museums and things so I could see the things that I loved. My mom had a fossil collection. My mom had been a middle school math and science teacher. And they saw that this is what I loved and they helped me embrace it. But I remember distinctly being 17. I believe it was at my high school graduation party. My youth pastor came and he said, well, it doesn't really matter that you're going to college. And that I had just gotten the day before an email from, it was a state school, but they had within their counseling center a Christian pastor on staff who was able to reach out to all of the incoming Christian freshmen and ask if they wanted to have a Christian roommate. I was excited about this. And my youth pastor says, well, it doesn't really matter because you're going to lose your faith anyway. because you are going to a state school and you are going to study science and you're going to walk away. I was 17. He is a pastor of a church now. I was strong enough in my faith that, and perhaps a little rebellious enough to go, oh yeah, watch me. I'm going to prove you wrong. But I remember that. And I remember being horrified and angry about it. I remember working with a college group at that same church years ago and being asked to speak on a topic that was scientifically related to a mixed group of male and female that were over the age of 18. And I remember someone saying, well, you know, you're a single woman and a scientist and we can't necessarily trust what you have to say because no one else has reviewed it. You're a scientist and you don't really believe in God the same. And I was like, are you joking? What? I felt that from the church, that I can't be trusted because I'm a scientist. On the flip side, I've also had scientists not know if they could trust me because I was a person of faith. And for science, it doesn't matter what your faith is. You're a person of a faith. And perhaps could be equally as doubted if you're Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist as if you're Christian. I really believe that there is a need for more people of faith in science to help kind of break the barriers down. The ethical ability that people of faith bring to some of these questions is necessary, especially for the afternoon. The ethics involved in some of those is massive. And I think that it saddens me that there's this dichotomy set up of you must pick faith or science. They're against each other because that's not who God is. God is the author of both. Science is the study of the natural world. The natural world is created by God. Theology is the study of scriptures. We have these two different ways of getting to know God. And I think if you remove one, you're missing out on a full experience of getting to know who God is, and really, I think also on our purpose and why we're here.
I wanted to ask two questions and return to a happier note. And I've really benefited from Jewish anthropologist Ernest Becker's writing on death awareness and its role in shaping culture. And I think Becker would say what makes us human is that we are creatures that are uniquely aware of death, our ultimate demise, and that it could happen at any time. And this generates and motivates all kinds of constructive and destructive activity. If that's the case, I'm wondering if, and President Matthews, I'm thinking of what you said too in your opening comments. I don't think anthropologists have ever found a human group where religion and art was not present. And if that's the case, I'm wondering, would you think that religion and art serve an adaptive purpose? So that's my first question. And the second one, probably more to you, Don, and maybe Eloise too. You said that, I can't remember if it was Cobb or Odin, I think it was Cobb, right? That God has given the created order a degree of freedom where social and biological processes are allowed to unfold, right? And that's how creation is free. If God intervenes in a social process or a biological process, how is that allowing creation to be free? You mentioned Jesus was in the womb of Mary for 9 months. How did Jesus get there? It seemed to be an end around a natural process. So just two questions: religion, art, adaptive, and is God interfering with the freedom given to creation by interrupting social and biological process?
All right, I'll do just the first one. Do religion and art serve an adaptive purpose? The main problem I have is with the question, because it seems to imply that evolutionary history's meta-narrative, the secular meta-narrative, is the final one. So that survival is the end goal. And so now the question is, now religion and art become subsumed under that larger survival goal. And so that isn't actually how I would go about it. Anthropologists have really tried to find something that makes humans unique. They've tried, you can see it in the history of ideas in anthropology. Well, first it was tool use. And then we discovered not tool use, but tool making. Constructing a tool means you have to think about how you're going to use it. So it's the cognitive function there that's unique to humans. But chimps make tools, and other animals also make tools. They clearly have forward thought. They're constructing them for a purpose, and then they use them, and then they pass it on to their young. They teach their young to do it. So it isn't like, it isn't that there isn't a piece of culture there, because for a while there we thought, well, it's what gets learned and passed on. But this gets learned, and then it gets passed on in other species. We thought speech, maybe, and then we taught chimps to talk a little bit, and gorillas too, and they were doing pretty well, actually, right? Then we thought social organization, but of course we know there's social organization throughout the animal world, so pretty much you name it, and it's there in some rudimentary form in other species, and that actually includes art. So chimps are capable of some level of making art, and they have some level of symbolic thought. That's where I had put, where did we start to become human? But I'm aware that non-human species do those things as well. And so even that is found in the other species of the world. So here's my thought on that, and that is, I realize I shifted your whole question out of existence here, but I am trying to answer it, actually. I promise. So I actually think all these attempts, it's interesting to me that the anthropologists, secular anthropologists, want to find something that makes us unique. Why should they want that, right? They see us as just another species in the larger order. But they have really tried and haven't found anything. And we too, even as Christians, well, how are we different? We commonly say it's because we have the image of God in us, and then we have this long history and theology of saying, well, the image of God is this, and the image of God is that. It's, it's our mental capacities, it's our ability to have relationships with one another, and all of those things are found in rudimentary forms in the animal world as well. And so we end up coming up with nothing. And so what I'm suggesting here is that I follow Dr. Enns and those others who say that the image of God is in the fact that he selected us out to be his representatives on earth. So that means it has nothing to do with us, right? It actually isn't anything about us. And that fits the biblical narrative in multiple places where God picks unlikely people who don't have special skills. Moses, who couldn't talk well, right? Says, I choose you, and you are going to do this for me. And so what that means, and trying to get back to the question here, is that, religion and art probably do have an adaptive purpose. I don't think that's why they're there necessarily. The whole of creation is there as part of God's expression of his creativity. We have an expression of creativity as well. And you can see that in how we connect with God, right? So our Christian faith is in all languages, and church services have different styles, and yet in that creative expression, rather than just the need to survive, right? In that creative expression, we can see that we are doing what God called us to do, not being somebody special necessarily. I want to see if you have a little follow-up on that, or if you have more you want to say there.
I would love to hear you address whether human beings are uniquely aware of their mortality in a way that other creatures are not.
Well, all creatures avoid death, right? They all avoid death. And I'm trying to remember now, this is not coming from me. It's more like the awareness of the self is more likely to be an arena in which we at least are beyond the other animals. We have a greater awareness of ourselves, and that could be connected to imagining our dying.
I'd like to track what was just said and mention Soren Kierkegaard and Reinhold Niebuhr and their understanding of the uniqueness of humanity having to do with our awareness of our spiritual as well as our natural selves. And what they mean by that, as I understand it, is that we're at one and the same time able to imagine ourselves in transcendent ways. So our transcendence combined with the obviousness of our limitations produces an ontological anxiety in us that leads to action. We'll either trust God to resolve that basic dilemma or to take matters into our hands in unconstructive ways that injure others. And so it may be that thinking of our ability to imagine what is beyond ourselves is something unique to humanity. And the tension that produces in us, it's certainly where heretofore in track that. I just offer that for consideration. As for God's intervention and how that may inhibit or resist what I have said about freedom of creation, I find coming to mind a chapter that I read in a book by, I won't go into those details, that's too much information, but the chapter's by Richard Schneider. It's called Seeing God Where the Wild Things Are. Seeing God Where the Wild Things Are. And what he does there is he focuses on Job. And in Job, he basically sees, on the one hand, those who think God is in control of all things, and if this has happened to you, then obviously you've done something wrong, and you ought to just repent of it. Repent of it and die, as it said right before God speaks in the 38th chapter. And what Schneider sees in God's response, Job, includes these observations, that wherever we see water in the scriptures, I don't know that he would say it quite that broadly, but he says that we should think about creation. And that in the 38th chapter of Job and following, we do have statements about creation related to water. Where were you when I laid the foundations of this, etc.? And there are two monsters mentioned, I believe it is, and they're both the chaos monsters of the time, Leviathan, Behemoth. And what God says to Job about them is that they're still free to roam on the earth. But what you've experienced is something of the continuation of chaos in the world. I have reined them in. They can only go this far. They cannot thwart my plan for all things. But they're still there, because stuff happens. And it's not necessarily from me or the result of your behavior. I think I have that right. So in that interpretation of the story is the tension that I'm working here, where there's genuine freedom, and yet it's a bounded freedom. That's why I like the shepherding analogy. The sheep can still get away. Another thing I'd like to refer to is the work of Dorothy Sayers, and how in her work she seems to envision the work of God in very dramatic terms. And it seems to me that theology is going to gain traction in the world for our meaning-making efforts, has to be able to take account of the drama of things. And drama has this odd necessity about it. It requires freedom and purpose. It requires surprise and intention. And if I'm looking for something that may, in effect, be God's choice as to how and when God will intervene, it might be when the plot of the drama is at stake. The plot of the drama, the God in the story, Yeah, the plot of a drama, the story that God has in mind. That's the way I'd like to say it. Well, that's a lot said in response to your question.
We have time for one more brief question.
Oh, I don't know how brief this will be. This is just kind of a broad question, though, as far as and taking more of a constructive and longer-term focus as we talk about evolution, but as well as technological advancements. In the sense that we're now looking at space travel being a reality. Transhumanism is also an AI development. So I'm curious to hear from you all, maybe just briefly, I guess. Where do you see humanity going, especially given in the light of a Christian conception of an eschaton or an end? And what does it look good, or is
I hope you're sticking around for after lunch as well.
I can answer very briefly. I think the parable of wheat and the tares is the most helpful for looking to the future, the good and the growing together until the time of the harvest.
I think that our technological advances come with a lot of responsibility. I think that we need to deeply consider what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to have rights, and we need laws and guidelines that will guard those rights. But we also need to think about what is not human, and how close could something get to being human before it becomes something we would give those rights of humanity to. I worry about a lot of it, because I think as much as there is potential to do a lot of good and cure a lot of diseases and to do a lot of really good work, there's also the opportunity that we will, in fact, get closer to some of the evils that humanity has done in the work of trying to make everything perfect. We will lose the things that are actually part of the good and diverseness of humanity. I worry that we will lose a lot of what makes us human if we don't operate ethically in this, and see that perhaps we shouldn't live forever, and we shouldn't have full control of things, and that we need to recognize our place in this too. So there's great potential for good, great potential for harm, and I think having Christians at all levels in this work and in the regulations around it be incredibly necessary in setting a really good ethical perspective for this.
There are, of course, lots of ways of construing Christian eschatology, and I tend to favor a proleptic way of thinking about Christian eschatology. That is, that humanity ought to keep in mind a vision of what is to come and make it as much a reality in the present as we possibly can. Now, if we keep in mind what we believe the divine community is, who is God? What is the relational identity of God? Mystery though that is. And that the goal of, if we take the view of Christian eschatology that would say that the goal of God is for us to be a part of that divine community. If we do that, and it'll help us keep in mind what kind of community we ought to be here and now, and what humans ought to be becoming here and now. Now, I know that doesn't get into nitty-gritties of questions raised by psychoneurology and genetics, etc. Just so much on the horizon has tremendous promise and tremendous risk. And I often in life go back to Deuteronomy. God, sets before them the promised land and says, behold, I set this before you. And basically what happens to you, and it depends on what you do with it. Will you keep me in mind, or won't you? Will you keep what I've taught in mind. And I recommend that eschatological vision of future divine community, and are continuing to keep the attributes of that community in mind in our formation of community and the formation of that of humanity in dialectical relationship with the community. I need to say that the formation of individuals, dialectical relationship with the community.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists today for your wisdom. I feel better equipped to communicate these sorts of truths. If I can boil down what I've heard today, both in the questions and in the wisdom that was shared, and maybe even in my own experience, is that I think the reason why this issue in particular becomes this lightning rod issue is because it decentralizes humanity. And we're so used to being, God's precious baby, then the special one. And you mentioned how many anthropologists have been searching, even secular anthropologists, for what makes us special, what makes us unique, what makes us the best. And what evolution does is it says you're not all that special, and that's hard for us to hear. Personally, I don't know. I think I'm pretty special, but the rest of you, I don't know. But something I want you to go out with, and we'll take a 15-minute break to get some, to use the bathroom, to get some coffee, to get some snacks, whatever it may be. Something you mentioned, Dr. Meneses, at the very beginning, is that in your timeline of humanity and of evolution at large, you mentioned a time period in which Homo sapiens were not the only hominins around. That even in our DNA, we see evidence of Neanderthal, if you come from a European descent, the Denisovans, especially if you are of Asian descent. We've got Homo erectus running around there as well. And so we know that if we were close enough genetically to interbreed, we must have been close enough to intercommunicate. That Neanderthals had dreams. Perhaps did they see God? And what would that have looked like? I mean, the earliest evidence we have of anything that looks religious are what we call these Venus figurines that are very ancient, basically idols of women. The oldest of which is 40,000 years old, carved of woolly mammoth tusk. You imagine 40,000 years ago, someone carved a woman, potentially for religious purposes, or I don't know, maybe it was a Mother's Day gift. We don't really know. But we can imagine, because every culture now seems to have some measure of spirituality and art. What did it look like 40,000 years ago? To walk around the fire and ask somebody about the divine, to ask a Neanderthal or a Denisovan or whatever other subspecies there are. So there's your conversation topic for your 15 minutes. Because there is no answer to this question. That's why I didn't ask you all, because we don't know. They didn't have written language. They didn't leave any evidence. What do you think a spiritual conversation or worship service or whatever it may have looked like 40,000 years ago with multiple species of hominins walking around? So go have yourself a little break. We'll come back in around 15 minutes with Dr. Pete Enns. Will lead us in furthering this conversation.